Welcome to Football Island again, and a beautiful day it is here for another edition of Gridiron Nation on TSN. Why are we here inside on such a beautiful day? Well, we want to tell you about Canadians in the NCAA. We want to tell you about U Sports as we do every week, and we want to tell you about the guy who brought football back to the Sioux in the CJFL. But first, Gord, let's talk about Akeem Messidor, the 6-year defensive lineman out of Ottawa, and he was a one-man wrecking crew for Miami this past week in a game that looked close on the scoreboard, but it really wasn't all that close. Tell me about his draft prospects. What are his pluses and what are his minuses?
Yeah, I agree. That game wasn't as close as the final score made it look. Florida State made a game of it late, but Miami was up big. And Messidor, I thought, really showed out on a large platform on the bright stage. We talked in last week's show about how his compadre on the other side of the line, Ruben Bain Jr., has kind of overshadowed him this year. But maybe not so quietly anymore. Messidor is really performing for this Miami Hurricanes front, and a team that looks like they're pretty much destined for the playoffs at this point in time. They're going to be a heavy favorite in basically every game the remainder of the way. So they look like they're in very good shape to be on the brightest stage. And this is a boon for Messidor, who has had a very strong career, but he's a 6th-year guy and a guy that has not necessarily put up off-the-charts counting stats since his move to Miami. He was great as a freshman at West Virginia. We were really excited about him then, and I think that what's evolved for him since he's moved to Miami is he's become a much more well-rounded player and made himself more pro-ready. I feel like at West Virginia early in his career, he was very much a straight speed rusher, a very good pass rush specialist, but not necessarily a guy that could get it done on a down-by-down basis, and you have to at least be passable in the run game to be an NFL guy. I think he's really improved that part of his game and made himself much more attractive to scouts that way. In terms of downside, I mean, compared to Ruben Bain Jr., he's maybe not as explosive as him, but I think the athletic skill set is fine. But I kind of already mentioned what will, I think, be looked at as his downside, which is that he is a 6-year guy. He's an older prospect, and I suspect that probably puts a cap on his NFL draft stock. I think he would be very happy to sneak into day 2 in the NFL draft. I think that's a reasonable possibility at this point. But I do think, like, if you're thinking maybe he goes round 1, I think that's probably unlikely because of his age and the fact that he is a little bit of an older prospect at 24 years old right now.
Before Syracuse fades into the pack like they do every year, and Canadians love Syracuse, by the way, because there's usually prominent Canadians on that roster. We've got one. He's a freshman player that comes out of Quebec. His name is Antoine Delorier, and there was a lot of hype around him, and he's lived up to the hype so far.
Yeah, he's been fantastic. I mean, starting as a freshman at that level is outstanding stuff in and of itself. And I thought that he's done a really good job of captaining that defense from his middle linebacker spot. I believe he's the team leader in tackles at this point in time, and he's been flying all over the field. And we've been very fortunate as Canadian football fans the last couple of years in seeing so really exciting young linebackers emerge down there. You know, Eamon Ogwong-Bamiga going back a few years now, Darius McKenzie at South Alabama right now, and of course Daryl Jabome with his star turn last season. Even though the encore maybe hasn't been quite as impressive this year, that's a good legacy for Delorier to follow, and he's been very impressive. And I will point out, like, yeah, Syracuse on the whole does look pretty mid right now, but so does the rest of the ACC, aside from basically Miami. So the fact that they might fade away into the pack, I mean, is not necessarily a given, because it feels like almost that entire conference is the pack at this point in time. So they could be anywhere from 2nd to 10th in the conference by the time the dust settles here still.
So let's go to Border Ballers and Alex McComb and see if he's found sleeves for his shirt this week.
Welcome back to Border Ballers, where we make clothing decisions count. Speaking of making things count, Wake Forest defensive end Noor Gatquaf had a strip sack fumble recovery erased earlier this season. That wasn't the case this weekend when Virginia Tech left the Edmonton product alone off the edge for his first sack of the season. He also had 2 TFLs in the W and faces winless Oregon State on Saturday. Moving to the secondary, Ty Benefield almost created his second turnover in 3 weeks when he forced a fumble in the loss to Notre Dame this weekend. Boise State's leading tackler made it clear he wants his defense swarming to the ball. something the Vancouverite will continue doing hosting New Mexico on Saturday. Let's finish closer to the Great Lakes at Michigan State, where Malcolm Bell has been putting receivers on an island, averaging 30 snaps per reception, one of the leaders in the Big Ten in that category per PFF. The Montrealer has UCLA next, when he'll likely keep lining up at corner, in the box, in the slot, at D-line, everywhere, doesn't matter. That's it for Border Ballers. I'll see you on Saturday.
Thank you very much, Alex. Now, Gord, who is your NCAA Canadian of the Week?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, it's got to be Akeem Messidor. Biggest game of the week as far as I was concerned, and he was the guy that made the biggest standout showing of the week. I do want to shout out Ty Benefield, who was excellent as Boise State played hard at Notre Dame, ultimately falling short. But Messidor, this was an ideal performance, I think, for him and his pro prospects. Not only does Miami get the huge victory on the largest stage, but he racked up 7 total tackles and a sack. So he gets that. The counting number with the sack shows that he can close on something like that, but it also, I think, was illustrative of that well-rounding of his game that has occurred over the last couple of years. I think NFL scouts will really like to see that. Anecdotally, watching the game, I thought that he was excellent in anchoring against the run as well, and he was a pretty significant factor across the field, a couple chase down tackles from behind as well. So I thought that it was a really good tape game for Akeem Messidor, and the stats are excellent as well. He's very clearly my player of the week.
When we come back, it is time to talk a little 3-down college football. Stick around.
This portion of Gridiron Nation is brought to you by Crown Produce. Keep it fresh, Canada.
Welcome back to Football Island, everyone. Montreal and Western, they escaped with wins over the weekend, but they were pretty surprising wins, not for the good reasons, I think. McGill went into Côte-de-Neige. You might remember they upset the Carabins a few weeks before, but McGill ended up going in there. They took a 14-0 lead. These two teams were actually tied at 28 with 4 minutes left. As for Western, you can imagine there isn't an OUA database in creation that can tell us, Gord, when they won a conference game without a touchdown. But that's exactly what they did in Windsor in a 15-9 win. What does that tell us about these two teams that are contenders?
I mean, I think that for Western, I think this is as simple as sometimes you get into the doldrums of the season and you have a bit of a sleepy game that you just kind of need to survive. I mean, we see it down south of the border all the time as well. And to their credit, they managed to survive. One thing that Windsor has been pretty consistent with is they have been a consistently stout defense. They haven't been able to put up the points this season to make themselves a real serious contender, but that defense has always been good, and they've historically played Western pretty strong. So I wouldn't think that this is much more than a hiccup for Western, and I'm not super worried about it. As for Montreal, I would love to have some discussions and test my French skills with some of their coaching staff to find out exactly what it is that McGill seems to have on them, because they seem to kind of have their number this year. We thought a couple weeks ago when the McGill pulled off that upset, okay, well, is McGill for real? Well, they followed that up by losing to Sherbrooke the following week. And so I don't think McGill is for real, but for whatever reason, they seem to give the Cards everything they can handle. They did it both times this season, and the Cards just escaped. So I think the instructive part moving forward is, do we see any indications of the same issues for the Cards moving ahead? One of the things that has been a consistent issue even in their win against Laval, but also in their loss against McGill in this game, is that the run game just quite simply has not been effective enough, and they've had to put too much on the shoulders of their quarterback, Pepe Gonzalez. So I think that that's been their biggest challenge in these two games, and something that is becoming for them a bit of a trend that they're going to need to fix quickly.
McGill and Laval playing next week. That will be an interesting barometer for sure. Going into the Thanksgiving bye week for all teams in the Canada West, when you sit down and you eat your turkey, Gord, and you try to unravel it all, and how do you untangle this Canada West Conference right now?
So I would say the two drumsticks, so we're talking the choice cuts, the one that everybody fights over, or the two Saskatchewan teams. I think the Regina is still the class of this conference. I think the white meat, it's still pretty good if you doctor it up right, you catch it on the right week, is going to be Manitoba. I do still think that that's a legitimate playoff team and one that can still hang. And of course, we saw them beat Saskatchewan earlier this season. So they're a bit of a dark horse right now for me, I think. And then your stuffing, the guilty pleasure, but not necessarily going to fill you up, is going to be UBC, who can do some really fun things for you, but at the end of the day, just doesn't get the job done consistently enough to be a real factor here. And then your Gizzard, which if you really want to try something wild, then maybe you do, but most weeks you want to just pass on it are going to be the two Alberta teams. They're still in the picture, and some people probably like their teams quite a bit, but they're just not quite at the level of everything else on that table for me. Of course, you dump some gravy on anything and I'll eat it. So any of those can work. And then that, of course, is the Canada West in a nutshell, is that it wouldn't shock me if the University of Alberta is in the Hardy Cup final this year. It's still all over the place and still wide open. UBC holds a tiebreaker on Calgary. That might matter for the last playoff spot, but UBC now has to beat Saskatchewan and Regina at home to get out of this. So I don't know if they're capable of doing that.
All the Brussels sprouts are at the end of that schedule for UBC with Saskatchewan and Regina. Green food, I guess. Hey, who is your U Sports Player of the Week?
Speaking of UBC, it's going to be Drew Viotto, and he's a guy that we talked about on this program when he was south of the border as a possible, the next great Canadian hope at quarterback, and that never quite materialized for him. He was a fairly highly regarded recruit to Minnesota initially in his career, moved to Eastern Michigan, and now back to UBC. And at UBC, it's been kind of hit or miss. They've waffled back and forth between him and Derek Engel throughout the season. It felt like it was settled in Viotto's favor a couple weeks ago. He has kind of been the guy moving forward, but this week I thought was his game where he consistently put it together, led a frantic UBC comeback, got them the lead late. They ultimately squandered that lead, but almost 500 yards passing for him. When you watch him play, Jim, at this level, it's clear that the ball comes out of his hand different. He has to work on the touch. He consistently sails receivers too often still at this point in time, but I'm confident that that's something that will settle as he begins to settle in and mature a little bit more as a quarterback. And I think that this guy, probably not this year with the way UBC's looking right now, but in future seasons is going to be a potential 4-3 reckoned with out west.
When we come back, we'll talk about the guy that brought elite football back to his hometown. Stick around.
This portion of Gridiron Nation is brought to you by NFL Canada.
High school football coaches nominate your players for the NFL Canada Way to Play Awards. Each week, winners earn a $3,000 equipment grant for their school program. Show us game footage that highlights safe, proper technique, and impactful play. Winners announced weekly on NFL Live and on NFL Canada's social channels. Learn more at nfl.com/CA Way to Play. Welcome back to Gridiron Nation, everyone. As soon as Paul Orazietti headed back to Sault Ste. Marie as the athletic director of Sault College in 2018, he wanted to find a way to get a football team on the field in an extremely patient build that was derailed and slowed somewhat by the pandemic. 7 years later, the Sault College Cougars not only launched as an expansion team in the CJFL's Ontario Football Conference, they've made the playoffs in year one, and they've done it with a 4-4 record. Paul, first of all, congratulations to you for this. And second of all, thank you for all the work that it took to make this a reality. I'm sure you're not getting paid by the hour on this, because that would probably make you worry a little bit. Take us through the process of building a team at the elite level from scratch.
Yeah, it's it was a process for sure, and it was we were fortunate because when we started out, we gained approval from the OFC to get the team started. We had an opportunity to start in 2024, and just looking at it and having really undertaken a very similar project when I was with the West Shore Rebels or previously the Victoria Rebels, I understood what it took to sort of put a team on the field that really didn't have any players. So we gave ourselves the extra year, which was the best thing that we did. And really, I think any good recruiter will tell you that recruiting is really about sales, right? And so for us, what we were selling was opportunity. The teams that win and the teams that are at the top and the teams that have been well established, they can sell their tradition and history. But when you're the new guy, you're really selling that opportunity to come into a new program as an 18-year-old and really get a lot of playing time and get a lot of experience and do what junior football was meant to do, which is develop you. So that was our big selling point. And, we were fortunate to attract some really quality players from all over the country and internationally as well.
The Windsor Fratmen transitioned their operations to be part of St. Clair College a few years ago. Are there any lessons that you took away from what their process was? Because they're sitting there today as the CJFL champions.
Yeah, I think, we just saw it as a great outlet for, we were looking around for where we could play football as a college, and then seeing St. Clair having done it, not even realizing at that point how successful they would be. We chose to look at that model. I mean, it certainly makes some things easier, structurally, you have a lot more support, but I would say there are still some challenges doing it that way as well, because now all of your players have to commit to that, the price tag of going to school, paying for residence and other things. So, there's people like to look at all the advantages of being part of a college, which there are plenty, but I think, obviously there are some challenges as well, but for us as a college, it really fit well with what we wanted to do. And again, St. Clair has been the gold standard the last few years on, in the OFC and now in the CJFL.
I know that you were looking at many options. I think one of them was a Division III option through the States because, as people know, the Sault Ste. Marie exists on both sides of the border. Considering where we're at these days, are you kind of happy that you went the CJFL route?
Absolutely. To be honest with you, whatever the future may hold, we would love to be part of the CJFL, even if, I think it would be hard to get us out of the CJFL, even if there was a college league that started, because I enjoy the CJFL, having been an alumni as a coach years ago on the West Coast. And I really like, what the CJFL is doing. As of note, our men's and women's hockey teams both play in the United States from our college, and we love it. But as you mentioned, these days there are some challenges with the border, et cetera. So I'm really thankful that the CJFL took us in and was willing to allow us to be part of the OFC, and we're super excited about the future.
On a personal level, I mean, you were out here on the coast for a long time. You mentioned your CJFL experience also at UBC before you headed back to your hometown. Quickly, how meaningful is this that you're doing this in your hometown?
Well, it's funny. It's, it's a super, I think for me, it's very satisfying, very rewarding. I always used to come back to Sault Ste. Marie when I was recruiting for UBC or even with the Victoria Rebels and see the football talent locally that was sort of underserved. Sault Ste. Marie is a bit of an outlier in Ontario. We're fairly isolated and we're far away from major football centers. So we never really, a lot of our players after high school, even though they were sort of U Sport caliber, would just not get those same opportunities just because they were not seen as much, not recruited or under recruited. So I'd always thought that this would be a great community to have, a post-secondary level football of some form. And that was, just kind of one of those things that passed through my mind every time I would come home in the summertime. And so to be back now for, which was in some parts unexpected that I would ever return to the Sioux, and then to be back and to be able to, sort of fulfill that sort of notion that I've always had, it has been really cool, really satisfying. And I think it's been, more importantly for me, I think it's going to hopefully leave a legacy for the young football players in Sault Ste. Marie and give them that opportunity that I've long thought they've deserved.
Yeah. Thanks very much for creating this opportunity for those athletes, not only this year, but in future years as well. And Paul, thanks very much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Jim. Great being with you.
Coming up, Picks of the Week.
This portion of Gridiron Nation is brought to you by Crown Produce. Keep it fresh, Canada.
There it is, our CFC 50, the top 10 high school programs in the country for this week. By the way, if you're a high school football player born in 2009 to 2011, head on over to CanadaFootballChat.com to register now for the CFC Evaluation Camp Tour stop in one of 9 locations across Canada for your chance to play in the 2026 CFC Prospect Game on TSN. So, Gord, I guess I'm going to have to take this Washington Huskies hat off, considering what your NCAA game of the week is.
Yeah, they might have to be the enemy this week, at least temporarily, as they host Rutgers in a standalone game Friday nights, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern time. One of those tough late kickoffs for the East Coast teams going all the way to the other side of the country. And what we have seen is that a trend is that East Coast teams have struggled, especially in the first half, in these kickoffs. I look in the direction of, say, Penn State this past weekend, or even Duke, who eventually won at Cal, but had a shaky first half. And so Rutgers is going to have to figure out how they can start this game with their A game in a tough environment and a tough opponent with a Washington Huskies team that is flirting with contention in the Big Ten. But for Rutgers, it's early, but it's getting late early. They've already lost their 2 opening conference games. They drop a third, and now they basically have to run the table because they have SC, Ohio State, and Penn State left on the schedule, and those are going to be really tough orders, those 3 games, so they have very little margin for error already. They kind of need this victory if they want to be seen come late December in bowl season.
Quickly, what's your U Sports game of the week?
Quickly, there's not a lot of interest, if I'm being honest, in U Sports this week. With the Canada West off, we don't have a lot of great matchups lining up, but you alluded to it earlier, Jim, that Laval-McGill game is an interesting one because McGill has played, as we talked about, Montreal tight twice now, winning one of those games, of course. Laval is a different story. And so the question I think that can be answered here is, does McGill just have Montreal's number? Or, and it feels weird saying this, is McGill actually a potential force to be reckoned with these big 2 in the Quebec Conference?
For everyone here on Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullin saying, let's get out to the game.